the late Pope Francis, said, "We're not in an era of change. We're in a change of era." And I think that that encapsulates where we are probably better than any short set of words that I've ever run across.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's podcast From the Top with your host, Chad Hesters. That's me. This is our inaugural podcast, and we're excited to have as our first guest, Dee Smith. Dee's here on purpose, ladies and gentlemen. For our inaugural discussion, we really wanted to have a big thinker and somebody that can help provide context to the world we live in. As a bit of a bio, Dee is a renowned CEO, producer, writer, but really he's a specialist in intelligence, foreign policy, and global change. He's worked in transactional intelligence, geopolitical and change risk analysis, media, and he even has, in addition to all that, he has a strong affinity for the cultural arts and has worked in production around that area as well. He's worked in over 100 countries and served as an advisor for over $120 billion in investment transactions. In addition to many organizations that he is part of, his day job, he's the CEO of a private intelligence agency called the Strategic Insight Group, or SIG. And he works with clients all around the world, including investors, law firms, and a lot of industrial organizations looking to put their money to work. And there's no better incentive than having skin in the game to really care about what's happening around the world. So, Dee, I know we could I could spend an hour going through your bio here. It's quite an impressive one, but I think our viewers probably get the context from that. So good morning to you. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Good to see you. It's delightful to be here, and I'm honored to be your first guest.
We're glad to have you. Where are you calling in today from, Dee?
Santa Fe, New Mexico.
All right. Great place to be at this time of year.
It is indeed.
Well, Dee, I don't want to be inefficient with our time here and spend a lot of time doing small talk. If it's okay with you, I'd like to jump right in with what I think is something that's been on my mind a lot lately. As a CEO of a global company, I think you know this, but our firm here at Boyden, we've got 75 offices in 45 countries, and I spend a lot of time just trying to make sense of the world, trying to make sense of what's going on and the macroeconomics and geopolitics. And it's a pretty confusing space, no matter how much you read. So I guess the big question I have for you is, we see all this uncertainty and unpredictability in, pretty much every corner of the world. And the, volatility in markets and rising social instability, and increasing warfare and saber rattling. Is there anything that ties all this together? Are there causes that vary from place to place, or is there some underlying themes that really bring all of this uncertainty and volatility together? I think a lot of people are searching to try to make sense of the world around us, and any insight you could share in it. And I realize that's pretty much a PhD dissertation thesis statement there, but we're grateful to get your view on that.
Well, that's a big question, Chad, and I do have some views on it. I do think that there are some things that tie it together. I think it's, and I'll just jump into them. The first one is the complexity of the situation, of the global system that we've created. And it's by far the most complex human-created system that's ever existed. And what we know, one of the big breakthroughs of the mid to late 20th century was in study of complexity. And just to make it very brief, complex systems behave in different ways. And particularly, they are unpredictable, and the unpredictability has to do with the level of complexity. So the more complex you make things, the more unpredictable they are. And so it's much harder now to make sense of things, as you were saying, because there's so many elements. I was talking not long ago to a very large company that deals with commodity analysis, commodity trading. And I was addressing about 100 of their executives. And one of them said, I said, well, what are your biggest concerns? And several of them, one of them articulated it, and several of them, said, yeah, that's absolutely it. Is that they said, we can't perform to budget anymore because the situation is so uncertain, and sometimes we're way over and sometimes we're way under, and there doesn't seem to be any way to predict it. And I thought that encapsulated this whole issue that we are simply in uncharted territory in terms of complexity. And I'll jump right in and say what I think about complexity. I think it kind of makes people deranged because they can't make sense of things. And the things that they do that they think we're going to produce X produce Z. And so, it's very stressful to live in a situation that's as unpredictable as this. The second factor, I think, is the politics of nostalgia, and that is the desire for things to be the way they were. And this affects, at least, let's just talk about the United States. It affects both sides of the political equation because you have, the Republicans now want to kind of wrench time back to the 1950s or maybe even the 1910s or 20s or some combination of that. And the left, the Democrats, want to wrench it back not nearly as far, but to another element that is gone, which is the so-called liberal international order, the rules-based order. And both of those things are impossible, but any more than, you can become a teenager again, however much you might want to. I don't want to, by the way, but some people do. But you can't do it. You can't turn the clock back to the past. And so I think what's been set up here, and this is the third factor I would pull out, is a huge feeling of broken promises. And I think, there's a concept called the social contract, which basically says if you do this, we, the society, the government will give you that. And in the case of the US and much of the world now, the social contract was if you work hard and you play by the rules, your life will get better and your children's lives will be better than yours. And that is something people don't believe anymore. I give frequent talks, and I always ask that question. Does anybody believe this, that your children's lives will be better than yours? I could count on one hand the number of hands that have gone up in, the last 10 talks I've given on that. And so, that it's a feeling of betrayal. And, there was an article in the Financial Times recently about how this particularly impacts the youngest working generation who feel that they were promised, at least in the Anglosphere in US and the UK, that they were promised that home ownership was not only a goal, but possible. And they now feel that that's been wrenched away. And that brings me to the final element that I will pull out, which is the politics of grievance. And we have created a society that is full of grievance and that makes grievance okay. It legitimizes grievance. And that then makes everything else more difficult. So those are the things that I think tie it together. And I think what you see then is this desire to go back to the past, this desire for authoritarianism, because I think people are flummoxed by the complexity of things. And so they're essentially saying, just give it to the leader. He'll make it right. And of course, that doesn't ever happen because the world is too complex to manage. And so, you've got a very dynamic situation. I ran across within the last couple of weeks a saying, a quote that I had not previously heard. And it was from Pope Francis, the late Pope Francis. And he said, we're not in an era of change. We're in a change of era. And I think that encapsulates where we are probably better than any short set of words that I've ever run across.
That's a lot to unpack there, Dee. I appreciate that perspective. Are you those attributes? And I'll make sure I got this right. The complexity of the system, we're kind of in uncharted territory in terms of complexity, politics and nostalgia, this feeling of broken promises, the social contract and the trail around it, and then the politics of grievance. Is this primarily kind of a Western issue? But is this North America, Western Europe experiencing this? And I'm asking the question because I think it's a human nature to be kind of myopic, right? And assume that your experience and your view is the prevailing view. But so help us understand that a bit. Is you saying this pretty much a distributed function around the world, or is it isolated in different operating environments?
Yes and no. It's a more intense expression of it in the Western world. That is definitely true. However, you see it everywhere in the world. For instance, in China, there's a saying that young people have, which is, there are two versions of it. One is let it rot, and the other one is lying low. The optimism is not there any longer. And you know that because you have figures in places like India, like Narendra Modi, who is an authoritarian too. And this appeal to somebody fix it, somebody make the trains run on time, somebody make it like it was. And I think there's a song in that. But it is a global phenomenon. And I think when you have a phenomenon manifesting in so many places, India, Brazil, Mexico, the United States, the UK, Western Europe, and so forth, then you have to look for a universal explanation. In looking for it, what I found are the things that I mentioned to you. Now, they're deeper sets of causes, which we could go into if you want to take the time. But I think that it is a global phenomenon, and it's just manifesting in different ways in different places.
One of my favorite sayings about human history is that, it doesn't repeat itself, but it darn sure rhymes. And I guess,
That's great saying. Yeah.
yeah, and it's sort of been my experience in just trying to understand how human beings operate. There are some patterns, but have we seen, your view, have we seen this pattern before? Is this, you hear a lot of people sort of compare where we are to the 1930s, mid to late 1930s. I don't know if that's a fair comparison, but in your perspective, like, is this what happens every once in a while? Is it every 4 generations and we get ourselves in this bind and it needs to be reset, or is this different?
I think it does happen repeatedly. And I think that you do have it every, 3 to 5 generations. And it's mostly observable in the West because for the last, several hundred years, the West has kept detailed historical records. So is China, by the way. And you do see this kind of thing in China, the period of the Warring States and so forth. But I think that, another element of this, and I'll just dive a little bit into the kind of deeper level of causes, is that from the Enlightenment on, there was we're talking, the 18th century to the very recent past. There was a presumption, because religion was not seen to be working, that we needed to rely on rationality. And that led to, and there's a lot to say about that, but that led to two things. One is that you could predict things with some accuracy, which we've now moved out of. And of course, you never could really do it, but you could do it better than you can now. And the second was that you could you made the assumption that people are rational actors operating in their own best economic interests. That's more of a 20th century interpretation of it. And that was based on a lot of theoretical analysis of economics as well as observational. And that became the kind of go-to idea. And the problem is, and this gets now to one of the other key things we're seeing, which is global splintering. The problem is that people are not, first of all, they're really not rational actors. They are emotional actors, and they make decisions emotionally. We all do. And then you put a rational gloss on top of it to convince yourself and others that you're a rational actor. But the emotional needs of people, and remember that we're animals like the rest of the living forms on the planet. They're plants, but we're the animals. And we evolved in very small units in various places in the world, starting in Africa. And those units were, a few dozen to a few hundred people. And they were very distinct from other units. And so this idea of identity, of who am I, what am I, who are my people, is very, very fundamental in human cognition, in human mentation, whatever you want to, it's the way humans are. And so what's happened in the last at least 100 years is that this accumulation of mass societies has begun to erase the ideas of individual and small group, where small group is more important than individual, small group cohesion and identity. And I think one of the things we're seeing right now is a tremendous backlash against those ideas. And that's why I frame it in the idea, the idea that we're all going to live in machine-like cities and do all these things, and how we act is predictable. That is a rationalist idea. And the problem, I think, is that the way we actually are is not that. We want identity. We want, and as a result, and I actually started keeping a list of global splintering, and I got so it was because it was 10 or 12 things a day, and I just gave up. But you just pick up a paper or go to a website or something and think about, well, I'm going to look for examples of global splintering in economics and culture and politics and so forth. And, you'll find them everywhere. And so we are in an age of a centrifugal force instead of centripetal force. Things came together for a long time. Now they're rapidly coming apart. And you will have people who will say that the motivators are economic or that they are security related, critical minerals, for example. And they are. But the bigger motivation is the human need for identity and for a group. Now, the last thing I'll say about that is the internet and social media has dramatically worsened it and also provided a forum for people to gather in a way that the birds of a feather flock together. But without the face-to-face communication that human evolution is based on. So, we're in a mess.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I think a lot about what the world looks like through the eyes of our firm's clients, and even our partners around the world. But if you're sitting in the room with board of directors and they're looking to you as a trusted advisor and they're thinking about, okay, all that's great. The world's, flying apart in a centrifugal way, but we still got to keep the business running. We still have to, have a sustainable and profitable entity. Or if you're a not-for-profit organization, how do you stay on mission and serve your clients? If you're trying to make decisions as a leader today about in this environment, what do you need to factor in your business planning for the next 3 to 5 years, which is really probably the maximum amount I think that people can really look out and have any kind of clarity is not even the word. I mean, in any kind of rational, set of expectations, which I know you were just trying to disprove that, but 3 to 5 year outlook, D, we're sitting in the boardroom. What do we need to factor into our planning here?
I think the first thing about that is mindset. Because I think you need to jettison the old mindset that we can and do understand what's going on. And you have to adopt a mindset that is much more geared towards taking the pulse of things on a continuous basis and changing assumptions on a continuous basis. And, obviously there has to lie behind that some kind of system of values, which should absolutely be there. And there has to be some kind of system of operating. But the idea that you can base it on this, I guess this is the key thing, to base what you're doing on the patterns of the past is, I think, irrational at this point, because the recent past is no longer a predictor of the near future. And if you look at things, business, whatever, basing your ideas on the patterns of the past, you will miss opportunities, you will misinterpret, you will miss signals, and you will end up making bad decisions. And so it's this constant monitoring. Now, that's a key thing of intelligence, by the way, intelligence as a discipline. It's called INW, or indications and warnings. And you're constantly scanning the horizon to see what's changing, what's coming up, what's new, how is that going to change things? And how does this thing relate to this thing and that thing and that thing, which may come back and change the first thing? That kind of thinking becomes absolutely required. And there's no going back. And this, is another thing that, as I said, that I think change makes people deranged. And I think there's this politics of nostalgia because people want to go back to something where they can predict it. Of course they do. But that is simply not where we are at the moment. And we're in Pope Francis' era of change. and change of era. And so if you as a board and as leaders try to resuscitate or practice went on in the past, you're simply going to set yourself up for failure. So what does that mean? That means that you've got to have much more of an ear to the ground. You've got to be much more sensitive to subtle changes, which can make huge changes happen. That's another complexity thing, is that you get little bitty changes that manifest 50 steps down the road into something that changes the whole. It's called the butterfly effect, which everybody's heard of. But so I think that and the third thing I would say is, and this is connected to all those things, and it's the point I end every talk I give with, which is what you see, what you perceive, and what you understand are based on how you look at things. And that is a hard thing to get across, it seems, but it's absolutely the case. And if you look at things according to the established patterns, the incumbent patterns, the patterns of the past, you're going to set yourself up for a really, really difficult fall, because that's not the way the world is right now.
Okay. Your comment about indications and warnings. I don't have the extensive intelligence background that you do, but in my earlier life, I did start my career off in the intelligence space. And we talked a lot about indications and warnings back then. And as I recall, in sort of the analytical training that we had to go through, there was this idea that you had to do everything you could to prevent your own bias, which is theoretically impossible to prevent all of your own bias, right? And to do that, you have to get the mosaic theory of information collection, right? And get a bunch of stuff in it, throw it up on the board, and see what it says. And so here's a question. Are business leaders in today's world, do you think, is an organization, especially a for-profit organization, are they able to even develop their own I&W system in-house? Or is there just such an inherent bias towards what happened in the past? Or if it's not your day-to-day job to pay attention to all this, can our organization develop its own indication and warnings capabilities? Or is that just working against human nature, and do you have to go outside and use somebody like SIG or, a variety of other inputs?
I think it's very difficult, and it's difficult for the reasons you just iterated. But I think that, well, I'll tell you, I was working for in a number of projects for a very large defense contractor, and one of the key people said, I don't believe in internal intelligence cells because they get too warped by the desires of the organization, and the things they don't want to hear get squashed down, and so they're kind of flying blind. And I think that is absolutely true. Now, I think people should have their own internal knowledge centers, but I think that you need the right kind of external advice that is truly, it is based in protecting your interests, but it is not based on protecting your ideas. Because a lot of times, I always tell people we're looking for trouble at SIG, 'cause so you can avoid it. But it's so easy to get into these biases and to think, well, that's never happened. That can't happen. If it looks like a duck and it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. It may not be a duck today. It may be, for example, a robot duck. And so you can't, and it's very difficult because of fear, which is another huge factor. And it's totally related to change, that people simply can't take on board. We all have this problem, taking on board things that indicate or strongly indicate that what the way you're thinking is not warranted. People ignore signs of cancer all the time. They ignore signs of infidelity in their marriages. They ignore all these things. They just put them out of their minds. The signals are there. But the problem is that if you're really threatened by them, it's very hard to take them on board. There's been some research on this, and it has to do with how emotionally painful it is to admit you're wrong. And this is one reason why people on either end of the political spectrum, or any part of the political spectrum, if you show them evidence that what they're saying is not correct, I mean, pretty factual evidence, it often makes them hone more. I mean, adhere more to what they've been saying because the emotional difficulty of coming to terms with the fact that they were wrong is so painful. And so, you have to, and, with the thing about independent, external intelligence company like SIG or many others is that, and this is why intelligence should be divorced from government policy, by the way, is that they don't have skin in the game of a particular thing. They will have skin in the game of the client, maybe it's a government, maybe it's a commercial client. Our skin is in the game to make things better for that, but we don't need to have this deal done. We need to find reasons why it's not going to be done. And this is the importance of falsification, which is much more important than verification. And so, you have a situation, you have many, many situations where I will tell you, I have delivered bad news to so many clients. I wish I had a dollar for every time. But, you find things that you go, oh, wow, we don't need to be doing that. Well, in our case, we suggest that you rethink this because you probably don't want to do that because here are the alligators. Here are the alligators in the swamp, and some of them are big and hungry, and so it's very difficult. I call this falling in love with the deal in the investment world, because people put their blood, sweat, and tears into these large transactions, and they're highly resistant to anything that indicates that, wow, you made a mistake. And that's one of the most difficult parts of our practice when we undercover stuff. It's not difficult to get there. It's difficult to convince people that they should listen to it. Now, it's their decision. And, you have these situations where people will say, well, that can't be right. Now, he's a good guy. He can't check it again. I mean, check it again. Yes, that's what even deeper evidence. Well, but that can't be. It can't be who I know this guy, and he's not going to do that. And then finally, hopefully you get to the point where they'll look at the actuality of it. But yes, it's very difficult to come to terms with that, just as it is to come to terms with the fact that you may have cancer or your spouse may be cheating on you or any number of things like that.
Yeah. So I think there's you've just underlined the answer to the question is get high quality external counsel on matters of importance to help remove your own bias, which I know may sound like a self-serving softball question from me to you, but I think it's a really important topic that, we have to guard against ourselves and our own arrogance and, sort of the tyranny of arrogance and decision-making. But it creates another problem. And that is that, and I think anybody, regardless of your station in life or your job or where you are in the corporate hierarchy or social hierarchy, we're all faced with the situation at some point where you have to speak truth to power. And that's hard. That's hard to be the person in the room that says, hey, I think you might have cancer. Or, hey, maybe we ought to not take that vacation for financial or other reasons, right? Or, hey, boss, this looks like, I know you're excited about this deal, but I have concerns. What is your advice as a professional prognosticator to power? What's your advice to people on how to navigate either raising hard questions or presenting evidence to people who might be really emotionally and mentally committed to something?
The first thing is to cultivate dissent. And you don't want a bunch of yes people, women or men, around you who are basically simply, reinforcing your biases or what you want to believe. And so, I think that a good management team is absolutely full of dissent. They're all on board for the organization, but they need to point out the weaknesses and alternatives. And if they see something and then they have to be listened to instead of dismissed. That's where it comes off the rails, actually, I don't think so. And what is I don't think so? That's an emotional response. And so, it's the dissent element is absolutely critical. The problem occurs when you're within a power structure and you're the CEO You're a CEO, I'm a CEO. You are the person to whom everyone answers. And then it becomes very difficult for them to do something that might threaten their own personal position. Again, it's fear, it's emotion. And so the leader has to embody and encourage an environment of open expression and dissent and taking people's things seriously. And that seems to be very hard for a lot of people to do. I mean, I think part of it is the arrogance and hubris that people get because, well, I'm the CEO. I made it to the top. Of course, I know what I'm doing. I had a friend a long time who was CEO of a major railroad company, and he very nicely would, this was back in the day, take me on his plane if I needed to go somewhere, and we got to know each other well. And he said, honestly, most of this is luck. He said, you do have to be there to take advantage of the luck and to know what to do with it. But he said, a lot of it is luck. And so he said, enjoy good luck while you have it. And I found that to be a very insightful comment. And so the idea that, I am the great I am kind of thing is just not warranted. But a lot of people fall into it. It's seductive.
So if we're trying to find leaders that are capable of dealing with this, very uncertain and dynamic and volatile and centrifugal world that we're living in and very likely going to be living in for some time, if you're trying to design a leader that's built for that world, if you're looking at your recipe, what are a couple of competencies that you're going to make sure in that recipe, regardless of whether that person's in government or they're in business or they're a not-for-profit or, in any sort of leadership capacity for the world we're facing? Like what would you prioritize as necessary capabilities or competencies for them to be good operators in the next foreseeable future?
First of all, I think skepticism, just about everything. And, the unwillingness to take things on face value. The second would be humility, by which I mean something specific. I mean people who don't believe they know, who believe they may not know. And that it can be cultivated. Some people are naturally that way, it seems. But it should be something that grows with experience. Because a lot of times you think things are one way and they're not. And that was true even before the world got so complex. And that the combination of those two things, skepticism and the humility to believe that you may be wrong, or you at least don't see the whole picture, I think are two of the most important elements that can be, that need to be present in a leader. Was it Seneca? Was some philosopher who said that anyone who has what it takes to get elected should be prohibited from holding office. And, the problem is that because we are basically, individuated, small, powerless entities, however powerful we think we are, it's very difficult for people to have this desire to believe. And so when someone expresses things in the right way, and they're a politician or a business leader or a nonprofit leader, when they learn how to express it in the right way, it's very easy for people to just go along with it. And you see this over and over and over and over and over again in history. And it's one of our worst traits because it just sets us up for bad leadership and bad decisions. And I understand it, but I do think that some people just have that gift. And, they're born leaders, as they say. And those people probably are people we should be afraid of, actually. It's a very contrarian view, but it's just observation.
Sure. All right. So let's take that to the next, logical steps. You've created this leader in the lab that's a healthy skeptic. They have a high degree of humility, maybe some good emotional intelligence, which is, one of the things that, in our work around the world, we find that leaders that have a high degree of emotional intelligence, especially in today's environment, they can build teams that can work together. They are listening and sensing what's happening. And I would add that to the mix from our perspective as well. But let's say we've created this leader in the lab and they're deployed. I know you've never gotten a prediction wrong or an assessment ever, but we're told that occasionally in the intelligence community, an assessment may be off base or may have been, widely incorrect. What does our leader that we just crafted in the lab do when they're trying to pay attention to all the noise and they're trying to be a skeptic and they got to make a call? Because that's what leaders do, right? When it ultimately comes down to accountability, you're the one that has to make the call. So our leader makes the call and it ends up being the wrong one. What should the response be? Like, how should a leader in today's environment respond to that? And what's the learning cycle look like there? And how fast does it have to be?
That's a great and difficult question. And I've made mistakes all the time. I mean, that's the world. Our knowledge is very flimsy of the world, and it does not take into account everything, and it can't. And so you make a decision on the best information you have. Now, that should include, as we discussed, information that doesn't agree with what you think. And this is one of the problems that I think the internet has made much worse, is that people can simply hear and read things they agree with. And I spend as much time hearing and reading things I don't agree with, maybe more than things I do agree with. First of all, I might learn something. And secondly, I want my beliefs to be challenged. But nevertheless, you will make wrong calls. Or you'll make the right call, but now the situation's changed a day later and it's the wrong call. And I think it's very difficult for people to accept that leaders have foibles, that they have feet of clay, and that they may well make, doesn't mean they're bad or even a bad leader. It's a reflection of the paucity of knowledge. It's a reflection of the fact that we don't really understand all the factors that come in. Now, you can do things to increase that, like intelligence and so forth, but you're still, and a lot of times, any good intelligence company should say this, it should never be certain. It should be, here's what the data indicate, and here's what the discoverable data indicate. And we can give you an assessment of how strong the indication is or not. My background was in the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency. And they would always say, here's what we believe, but there's this other data, and you need to see it. And it may or may not be right. We think it isn't. That's what good intelligence should look like, and that's what good leadership should look like. And the problem is the humans want certainty. And so I was actually talking to a friend of mine, Jeremy Suri, who's a very interesting presidential historian of many things, but he's written a lot about the U.S. presidency. And we were talking about the fact that, according to him, the original intent of the framers of the U.S. Constitution was that leaders should be chosen, almost drafted, not elected by popular demand. Of course, that went away. And I said, I'm on the board of this wonderful museum in Cody, Wyoming, and half our board is American Indians, and they have repeatedly said, and I've studied this too, that the way leadership works in Indian communities generally is not an election. It's that a group of people, elders, whatever, they pick someone to be the chief, and often the last thing you want is to be the leader. It's because for the reason you mentioned, you've got the sword of Damocles hanging over your head every minute of every day. But they say, look, we think you should lead us. You have the qualities and so forth. And they, with reticence, take that up. And Jeremy said, well, that's exactly the way it was meant to be. He said, but in the modern environment, it's better. It's hard to imagine how people who say, well, I don't know, I don't think I'll do a very good job, for them to be selected to be the leader, when in fact they probably should be, because they've got the humility. So, it's a structural issue, and a structural issue almost always has to have a structural solution. And, this is where I think you go back to Pope Francis' thing. We're not in an era of change, we're in a change of era. Something is out there that is not close enough to see, but the near future, or at least the medium-term future, is going to be very, very different from the present or the recent past, because we've got to solve these problems. And, I have no idea what it is, but when I made that TV series about 8 years ago called World on the Brink, The one thing I could say to I talked to dozens and dozens of people, some on camera, many not. The one thing I could say, and this was 8 years ago, that everybody agreed with was what we have is not working. Of any political stripe, everybody agreed with that. And so that tells you something.
Most definitely. And just for our viewers' information, Dee was the creator, producer, and host of a television documentary series called A World on the Brink with Dee Smith. If you haven't seen it, you really should. It's great. It was in over 40 media markets around the U.S., and it's a very insightful program to watch if you can catch it. Well, Dee, look, I know you're busy speaking truth and to power around the world, and I know we want to let you get back to doing that. Just one final word from you, because I'm kind of the optimist, right? I know the world's uncertain, and I know that there's a lot of lions and tigers and bears out there hiding in the woods for us. But I hold the view that we're going to be just fine. We're going to get through it, and the same aspects of human nature that cause these problems are also counterbalanced by some really fascinating aspects that humans are adaptable and they creative. And so I look at the world coming up and I'm thinking, okay, like we got a shot at this. What is your hope for humanity and how are we going to navigate the next 3 to 5 years? Why are you still engaged and not just saying, oh, forget it, I'm going to Wyoming and, living in a shack or somewhere, right? What's got you optimistic?
Somebody asked that question in a talk I was in. I was not giving the talk, but it was a former U.S. ambassador to Iraq. This was 10 years ago. And he said, well, I'll tell you my optimism is however bad it looks today, it looks better than it will tomorrow. So I won't say that. But what I will say is that there is no problem, I repeat, no problem that we have that we cannot solve. It is a question of the will and the ability to direct ourselves to solving them. And I think that is a note of hope. We need to change the way we think and the way we act because we can solve all these problems. I mean, life may be different, but we can solve all these. We haven't even gotten to, climate change and all these other things, resource shortages. They're all soluble. They can all be solved, but it needs a different way of thinking.
Well, great. Well, Dee, I really appreciate it. You being our inaugural guest on From the Top. As expected, you did not disappoint. And, we could go for hours here and keep talking about this. You and I have had some good discussions over the years. Before we go, want to give you the opportunity to make a shameless plug here. If people want to hear more about your thinking and your perspective on the world, what are some ways they can plug into to that or maybe some things that SIG produces? What's the best vehicle for them to learn more about what you think about the world?
Well, thank you. And it's been a pleasure. The first one would be I have a Substack and it's called Big Change. So it's about global change. And there's a bunch on that, including links to the television series, which you can also find, A World on the Brink, which you can also find on YouTube. We have a blog at SIG called, and the address for sigintelligence.com, sigintelligence.com. And it's labeled on the website. And that blog is partly me and other people too. And it contains a lot of information that is interesting. And we try to always take a contrarian, or not, if it's not contrarian, just that not an obvious view of things. I am a believer that conventional wisdom is almost always wrong. But so those would be the resources to look at.
Well, thank you. I'm sure people are running out there right now to check them out. I wish you a good rest of your week, Dee, and I really am grateful for you making time for us. And for everybody else, we'll see you on our next podcast. We've got some great guests lined up for our next few shows. So from the top, Chad Hesters, and look forward to seeing you all out there in the world of uncertainty. Thanks, Dee. Have a great one.
Thank you.